All right, good people. Welcome to the live stream. There's no time like the present, although sorry, I'm a couple minutes behind here. It's a pattern for me, unfortunately. So we're here to talk about the ninth battle between the great Sam Langford and the great Joe Jeannette. It's happened in New York State. So this will be a newspaper decision. And this actually preceded a big fight at the end of the year in Paris between the two. Their 10th fight. And that actually survives as a highlight on film. I think it's parts of about 8 rounds of the 20. This is a shorter fight. I got to apologize. I actually had a mistake in the graphic on the show I did on the first, the anniversary of their 1914 fight. I had 1915 on the date for some reason on that fight, but here's the rivalry up to this point in 1913 between the two. First fight was in 1905 in Lawrence, Massachusetts, just north of Boston. Then they fought in Chelsea and Lawrence, again near Boston. Then they went to New York, 2 more in Boston. Then they had 2 at Madison Square Garden. This one right here, this was sort of the chinks in the armor part of Langford's career, or the first one. He came back from Australia, came in heavy. He wasn't considered to have been in good shape, I'll put it that way. And there were questions as to whether he'd get his form back. He blamed Australia. Like he referenced that it was hard to bring the weight off once he got back. And like I said a couple days ago, I thought it was the beer. But let's have a look. So Langford's 1913. I'll pull up his schedule here. He still had a pretty good season, but this fight that we're talking about here on the 3rd against Jeannette, he lost that. I think the Times had it a draw, but every other paper had Jeannette clearly the winner. And this was an unusual thing for someone to clearly get the best of Langford. Was not even later that year when he finally got to fight Gumbo Smith, because New York State was giving them a hard time about a quote-unquote mixed bout, so they ended up fighting in Boston. But even that, there were people who were surprised that Smith could get the best of Langford, using a lot of jabs. And in this fight, Jeannette using a lot of jabs. Langford he brought some extra meat, fat around the middle into this fight with him. And so this actually kicked off a lot of speculation, because coming into this fight, to get a sense of what Langford represented at the time when they fought, even though they've had these battles, here are the 6 seasons, and then additionally the part of 1913 season, so almost 7 seasons worth of work for Langford. You can see the red for losing it doesn't show up very much, to put it mildly. And actually, on the right column there at the top, Fireman Jim Flynn, that loss it was speculated he was carrying Flynn to keep hay in the barn, so to speak, get a longer booking, which they had and which he won. And that the loss at the end of that's the 1911 season, further down the column, to Sam McVeigh, that was actually a little bit contentious. The crowd thought that Langford had done enough because he was leading, though. So it doesn't necessarily mean he did. But McVeigh wisely chose to fight him on the retreat so that he wouldn't lose. So this was the level of success. And of course, the year after, 1912, the year after McVeigh beat him, he beat him 4 times in a row. They also drew in 13, but he beat him 4 times in a row in 1912. So he sort of settled the matter, at least for the time being, on their rivalry. So this is Langford's overall season. Not his toughest season or his busiest season. Still pretty tough, though. These aren't easy fights. Let's have a look at Mr. Jeannette, who didn't go undefeated himself, because he actually lost to Langford at the end of the year. But other than that, and including the win over Langford, other than that, he was entirely successful. That includes wins over, battling Jim Johnson twice, and Jeff Clark. Beat John Lester Johnson, who Langford also beat. So it drew with Harry Wills over 10 rounds in New Orleans. So Jeannette had a really serious year here. I think that's 13 fights, is it? Plus the Jeff Clark. I'm not going to stop the count. It's about that. Langford a little less busy and lost to Jeannette and Gumbo, but also beat Jeannette. And that fight with Jeannette was apparently a really, really big deal. This bout that we're talking about in October 1913, this was billed as a eliminator who was going to fight Johnson at the end of the year. It ended up being battling Jim Johnson, who fought Johnson, and I think it was the day before this, so it was December 19th, I believe. And on the 20th, Jeannette and Langford, they did battle there. I'm trying to remember. I feel like the French didn't want to recognize Johnson because he wouldn't fight one of them. They were trying to say this was for the world title, as the French boxing union, as they recognize it. I'm not sure. We're going to get to that fight later on this year. We'll talk in detail. Right now, we're talking about October 3rd, 1913. I made some more graphics, so let me pull these up while I talk. So the fight with that he had, the two fights he had leading up, Porky Flynn, the John Lester Johnson, he was let me see. The best way to approach this is not to go into the whole season. I did that yesterday, going fight to fight, but the graphics are up there. I think probably the best way to frame what Langford was. Let me find this little quote here in Clay Moyle's excellent book on Langford. So the Australian promoter Hugh McIntosh, who promoted Langford against Bill Lang in London, 1911, he promoted Langford versus Sam McVeigh in April 1911 in Paris, and then promoted their 6 fights that they had in Australia. Here's what he had to say about Langford. This is a quote from Clay Moyle's excellent book, but the quote is from Hugh McIntosh from the Knockout magazine in 1936. Boxing will never see another Sam Langford. There will never be another like the Boston Tar Baby, with his incredibly long, gorilla-like arms, his grotesque top-heavy body, coal-black and squat, his wide, engaging smile perpetually splitting his broad countenance, and his inevitable cigar. And more's a pity, for Langford, beyond all shadow of a doubt, was one of the miracle men of boxing. Something of a fistic freak, if you like, but a fighter nonetheless, and a remarkable personality. What an amazing glove fighter Langford was. No more than a light heavyweight, and so short that the majority of his opponents towered over him by 6 inches or more. Yet he was invincible. His physique was astounding. He was so hugely proportioned above the waist that at first glance he appeared almost as broad as he was long. His colossal shoulders, and black, smooth, and shining, suggested a wall of coal. His chest was so deep and barrel-like, and the length of his arms was something to marvel at. His speed and punching power were alike phenomenal, and so it was small wonder that even the great Jack Johnson, having once fought 15 anxious rounds with the Tar Baby, carefully sidestepped another encounter with him. Johnson was not afraid of a hiding, but he did not want to risk his title. I spent months trying to persuade Johnson to agree to a match for Langford, but he obstinately refused, and one day he frankly told me the reason. "Say, Mr. Mack," he drawled, "you're only wasting your time talking to me. I don't want to fight that little smoke. He's got a chance against anyone in the world. I'm the first black champion, and I'm going to be the last." That's a quote from Hugh McIntosh, although, to be clear, that was decades later. So this is Hugh McIntosh's recollection of what was said, which is somewhat of an important distinction to draw. We even see that today. People's stories, they change. They, if they just keep telling them, they naturally morph, even without any sort of malicious intent. But certainly, the essence of what McIntosh is saying there is Langford was freakishly good, freakishly built, but also freakishly good and tough. And you can see in those seasons, that's a lot of seasons to be the small guy in the division, in the heavyweight division, who doesn't necessarily belong there for some of those seasons. But why was Langford fighting at heavyweight in the years leading up to when he was actually, for this fight, he was almost 200 pounds, but earlier in his career, he wasn't proportioned as a heavyweight. Well, it was because he was so avoided by the guys his size. You can find some awesome poetry on guys not wanting to fight him. I'll leave that up for a minute. There's one that I found in the paper. I think it was in the newspaper, not a pamphlet. There's others. There's one I gotta find that has like verses hitting all the heavyweights. I think it was from around 1909, but it was taking the piss out of all the different middleweights who wouldn't get in there with him, including Stanley Cattrall, who did eventually fight him, but at the point the thing was written, he wasn't about it. So anyway, Mr. Jeannette here, he debuted in 05, I believe. Langford started fighting early in 02, but Jeannette, he was just fighting heavyweights. He wasn't a large guy himself. He was someone who often gave up size, but he was naturally larger than Langford had been at the start of his career. So he had a lot of heavyweight experience coming into this season, and his success continued. To try and find my 1914 graphic fin. Where did I put that thing? Oh, here it is. Yeah, so you can see Mr. Jeannette there. After losing to Langford, his comeback the next year, he just goes ahead and wins all of his fights. It's a lot of fights. What is that? 13 wins, 13-0-3 for the year. That's pretty crazy. You know, this is at a time when there are other guys being busy. Battling Jim Johnson was pretty busy, but not successful. Jack Johnson, successful, not very busy. I mean, very unconcerned with a busy schedule, but he's the heavyweight champ. He's got other ways to make money. So these guys, these are sort of like the perennial contenders. They're fighting for the colored heavyweight championship for the title Johnson was holding, the one that the wider public was focused on. They just couldn't get the fight. Even to the point where the guy that they would beat on, battling Jim Johnson, give him a stiff test, but they would, you know, fairly predictably could usually get the win over him. And he got a shot. And apparently it wasn't a very good fight. People wanted their money back, but Johnson claimed an injury early in the fight. Other people speculated he hurt himself when they fell, like later in the fight, but he did have some sort of minor fracture. So perhaps it's his own fault if he got hurt in the fight, but like perhaps take with a grain of salt that it went to a draw. As far as like how likely battling Jim was to beat him, it's just it wasn't a good fight. But Johnson claimed to be hurt, but he just wasn't interested in a Langford or a Jeannette as an opponent at this point. He fought them both. Fought Langford once. Fought a bunch of fights against Jeannette, but this was before they really hit their competition prime, especially as it pertains to heavyweight. I mean, Jeannette was fighting Johnson again and again right at the start of his career, which must have helped him in the long run, although it didn't help when it came to trying to get a fight with Little Arthur, with the Galveston Giant himself. Now, I'm not sure, but I feel like I read that photo on the right there, Jeannette, the top hat, that's at a race the day after he fought Sam McVeigh and won over 49 rounds in Paris. But I could be wrong. I could be totally off there. But I feel like I read somewhere that was he's out there chilling the day after this epic fight. He really was an Iron Man. He wasn't alone though. Langford and their other active great rival of the time, Sam McVeigh, they were peak tough themselves. These guys were all just out of their minds. They, the drive combined with desperation and the lack of options. We have options today, man. Like if you're an entry-level boxer and you want to just go get a warehouse job, you make more money that way, and have benefits. So it's different. Like at this time, you compare what they can make fighting compared to what they'd make doing manual labor or what was available to them, especially someone like Sam who wasn't, Langford, that is. Langford wasn't well educated. Like Jeannette and McVeigh were more cerebral, and cultured, you could say, but Langford was didn't get a lot of schooling. He's out doing manual labor and then started fighting when we would still be in school today, still be in high school. So anyway, so we're looking at 1913 Langford. He's been in Australia, tipping back the Tooth's Double Stout. Getting his beer in, living it up a little bit, had his car shipped to him, having a good time. I had a great measure of success in Australia. He lost the first fight, didn't lose again until his departure in 13. So he comes back. Jeannette didn't get in on the McVeigh in that end of 1911 to mid 1913. Jeannette was stateside, or he certainly wasn't in Australia, so he didn't get to weave into their epic rivalry, but they did plenty of it. I mean, he ended up only having one fight less with Langford than McVeigh did, even though McVeigh practically had him to himself at the highest level for a year and a half or so. So let's see. I did do quite a few graphics for this. Look at this. Let me just keep pulling these up, trying to remember to cycle through these. So they come in. So this is the point where people say, oh, is Langford past it? Like, is he just going to become fat and useless? And this was not the case. There were several points in Sam's career where people were questioning him openly, like, has he gone back? And then he would get it together. And as late as 1920, whipped himself into pretty fierce shape, fought a crazy schedule, mostly successful crazy schedule, but he couldn't get past Harry Wills by that point in his career. And Jack Dempsey was absolutely not going to fight him under any circumstances. So we end up with these great rivalries, in part because out of desperation, they need the big fights. The top opponents are there. They're just not the guy who can get them that recognize that world title. They're fighting for a title in a sporting sense, should be held in great esteem. But for the wider public at this time, it's a little bit different. That's why sometimes the newspapers, they won't even report if they're fighting for the colored heavyweight championship. Not every writer is even going to bother mentioning it, although others literally would list separate champions. This is in the run-up to Johnson finally unifying the titles in 1908. Prior to that, they would list the separate champions in the paper, but not every paper would even care to highlight the fact that there was any kind of championship at stake between these colored fighters. It's a bit of a weird time to research, but you just deal with it. And it's not just these guys that dealt with it. Johnson had dealt with it before he became the champion. Jeff Clark, Battling Jim did get a title shot, but he didn't get it from a white fighter. He got it from Jack Johnson, in part because Johnson was wary of fighting guys like Langford and Jeannette, who were scarier. They weren't as large as Battling Jim, but they were scarier. They had technique and experience that sort of dwarfed Battling Jim's. We see that today. We see politics. What's Tyson Fury doing? Is he fighting Usyk right now? He's been talking about it, fighting Joshua, talking about it. Did get fights in against Wilder. They were fun. But no, he's fighting Francis Ngannou because he's making a huge pile of money without fighting a guy who might beat him, Usyk. Ngannou's chances are very low, to be honest. Everyone should know that. Very, very low. Puncher's chance only because he is a big puncher and because, Fury's a little bit fat and older now, but technique-wise and experience-wise, he shouldn't be, even if Ngannou's working with Iron Mike, and if he's been training his hands for a long time. There's a difference. Fury's a master in the craft, so we'll see how the fight goes, but it'll be a pretty chaotic and shocking upset. And that's what it would have been like, if Johnson, say, got knocked out by Fireman Jim Flynn or the guys that he was fighting. Even Stanley Catchell, get knocked down by Catchell late in the fight before smashing him seconds later was a pretty shocking thing at the time. If he had actually lost to him, holy cow. Maybe not as crazy as Ngannou catching Fury, because Ngannou was a big fella. But these guys, some people get opportunities because other people aren't getting them. So right now, Ngannou's going to make MMA pay is bullshit. So Ngannou's going to make a multiple of his whole career earnings in this one fight. So that's why he's doing it. And Fury is going to make a ridiculous amount of money, a small fortune, without having to put as much risk. This is nothing different than the time, although because of the post-Reconstruction and racial dynamic, especially in the U.S., color was the excuse, not money or fame or who you beat lately, all that stuff. It was just one more excuse for guys to make money with less risk. Because you'd see guys like Ketchell's management had the color line on Johnson and Langford. Then Johnson becomes champ. The color line eventually goes away and they go ahead and fight. And then he goes ahead and takes Langford on at least over 6 rounds in a non-decision fight against Langford. And that's another thing too. Some of these guys, they couldn't get a long fight. So Langford being willing to take on Jeannette for 20 rounds at Paris at the end of this year, end of 1913, that's intense because you can look at a lot of guys wouldn't take Jeannette on in a long fight. And that's why big shout out to the great Sam McVeigh for actually booking a finish fight against Jeannette, which is insane because Jeanette's cardio was famously robust, to put it mildly. But these guys fought under all kinds of conditions. Sometimes people were trying to make fights and they couldn't happen. Like they were trying to put Sam Langford together with Gunboat Smith, as I referenced earlier, and New York State wasn't going to allow mixed bouts. Basically, the guy said, "Oh, it's not in the interest of New York to have mixed bouts." So they were like, "Oh, white dudes, black dudes, no, you can't fight each other. That's bad for sport." What they mean is it's bad for the racist public who are putting their emotional stock into white superiority. But that's, that's how it comes out. Just like today, it comes out. It's stated one way, but the motivations are less high-minded. Langford got a lot of fights in across racial lines, but it couldn't always happen. So that gunboat fight that didn't happen, they ended up fighting in Boston. I think it was at the Atlas Athletic Club. Don't quote me on that. So they did fight, and in that fight, Gunboat shocked a lot of people, not only among the crowd when he got his hand raised, but also just in the wider craft. In pugilism in general, he wasn't expected to win that fight because, like I said, because of what Langford was. But Langford, got a little bit heavy. So this was a time in his career where there were questions. He answered those questions. I mean, by the end of the year, when he takes Jeannette over 20 rounds in Paris, I mean, you could say the question, as far as whether he was done at that point, was soundly answered. It was the very next fight that Jeannette had as well, and it wasn't like days after the fight. So, I'm not sure what all was going on with Jeannette. I'll get to at the end of this year when I do the on this day for the Paris fight. That's gonna be one of the biggest ones I do this year. One of the biggest live streams because everything that was happening at this point, everything that was at stake, and also what appeared to be at stake but wasn't because of how things worked out with Johnson and the establishment. But the establishment meaning Johnson's relationship to the general public, to fighting white dudes, he could get like a broad appeal, a mainstream appeal, with less risk. Whereas the big fights against the top guys, just like Fury, how many more millions does Fury make if he fights Joshua or Usyk compared to what he makes against Ngannou? There's a difference, but it's not a huge difference in money. Oh, I make 15 million from this, I'll make 20 million from that, something like that, maybe. And the difference in risk is vast. That's sort of what Johnson was facing. That's what some of these other champions over time in combat sports have faced, especially in boxing at this time where the champions, it's hard to get stripped, right? It can happen, but Johnson won the title. He didn't fight the top guys. In England, they wanted to consider it a forfeit and recognize someone else, Langford. In France, they at different times wanted to consider him in forfeit and recognize someone else. It didn't happen. He still had that claim, again, because that's anchored to the general public's perception at that time, in the States especially. So after Johnson beat Tommy Burns in Australia, he went back to the U.S. He didn't go to England to fulfill the contract against Langford for May 1909, and he turned down 3 other fights offered to him in the U.S. against Langford. They just couldn't get it done. But the battles that happened for the colored heavyweight title after Johnson's reign, because he was the longtime colored heavyweight champion. So he didn't go undefeated in that time. He lost a close decision to Marvin Hart. I think he lost on a foul to Jeannette, but I don't think he got bested in that time from 03 to 1908. So Johnson's actual title reign, the unified part of it, lasted only a few months because these guys picked up where he left off with the colored for the same reason. They were getting stiffed. And so that claim is there for who's the black, not at this time who's the best black fighter in the sport, but who's the best black fighter who isn't Jack Johnson, who's holding up their opportunity. So it's just a weird thing. And sort of Johnson's, I won't say behavior, but Johnson's decision-making contributed to an excuse for people not to give colored fighters heavyweight title shots. And that lasted until Joe Louis. So I'm not saying he caused it, but it was used as an excuse. People were, the public at this time, they're easily triggered. I mean, they actually had race riots when Johnson beat Jeffries, even though Jeffries was old and making a comeback and shouldn't have been expected to win, even though he was a big guy. He just, they're remembering what was from quite a few seasons earlier. But yeah, they just couldn't handle it, freaked out. So it's just, there's what's happening in the sport. There are divides within the sport as far as how people perceive it, including mixed bouts and things like that, or what people should be doing. But then the wider public is much more uniformly, racist in practice. Like they don't want to risk any kind of looking bad or undermining of the argument. I've seen writers, it's pretty sick, writers saying, oh, basically saying all these black people are going to get uppity if they can maintain the world championship in this sport. Like people are going to start to see themselves as on par with white people. So it's a really messed up aspect to this research. It's not the focus of my research. Uh, I'm mostly interested in the sport, but it's you certainly have to take something into account if it's affecting the bookings. Like if Langford can't fight Gunboat the first time and is ready to be matched, and it gets delayed because the state just says, "Oh no, a white guy fighting a black guy." Holy cow, that would be bad for the state of New York. How stupid does that sound today? But at the time, there were enough people who believe that dumb shit to go along with it. Like in the general public, that you could say stuff like that. There are things today a politician would say, and 30 years ago, they maybe could have said it out loud. Today, they would be widely ridiculed. Although we are in a pretty absurd political time. I won't get into that, but it's at different times in history, you get different pushback for certain sentiments or statements. But at this time, yeah, you still could be writing for the newspaper and just be overtly bigoted and literally cheering against the sport happening and then get away with it, depending on who your readership was. Especially as, you know, the main papers are white writers writing for a white public. So in general, not as a rule, but in general. So in this fight, you know, it's a newspaper decision. It's October 3rd. Just to recap our series, why not? Where's my graphics for our series? Oh, no, a second, folks. I realize I'm just rambling here. I don't have a format for this yet. I know what I want to do, and I'm going to keep doing them, but I'm be working this out as I go. 100% winging it. Especially as the time I do have, I'm making graphics. I'm trying to want something kind of visual for y'all. So let's see here. Yeah, so here's our series so far. We did on the 28th, we did Dixie Kid and Sam Langford, their first of two fights. Well, their only fight in 1909. They also fought in early 1910. Langford took them. Then on the 29th was the anniversary of one of Sam Langford's, I think it was his third fight of 1905 with young Peter Jackson, Sim Tompkins. September 30th was the anniversary of one of Langford's fights with great Sam McVeigh. And then October the 1st was Langford and Jeannette's fight in October 1st, 1914. And that brings us to this one here. Let me pull my current graphic back up. You know, one of the main reasons that these guys had to do so much, they still did great things, but part of it was they couldn't get that giant fight, the fight with Johnson. Because what was Johnson thinking about? Well, until he got it signed, Johnson was thinking about this. He was thinking about getting Jeffries out of retirement. Jeffries, who wasn't going to fight a black man for the title, but later when the money was looking real good, there's a lot of social pressure on him to come out and take the title back, so to speak. He would challenge for it. He didn't have that title anymore. Tommy Burns had done a lot of fights when he had ended up winning the title that had been vacant until the fight prior. So he took over that lineage. He did a lot of fighting. So Johnson winning it, Johnson's career already, he had legitimized that title, at least to the point he won it. The hijinks afterwards, like the little games, well, that was partly to put this together. Here they are, made a pile of money, these guys, on this fight. But down in the trenches, the short money, these great fighters were fighting for relatively short money. But that's just how it went. That's just how it goes in sports. You know, there are guys, there are heavyweights who, wherever they are in the pecking order, their opportunity will suffer because the champions aren't as busy as they could be. So people get backed up, contenders kill each other off. Like they're already in a position where a title fight makes sense, and then they still have to keep just fighting dudes. That's sort of where these guys were, but they left a legacy of just amazing battles. Now I'm wondering if, let me just look through this book here. I'm trying not to read whole sections from Claymore's book. I did read that quote from a Macintosh interview, but I'm trying not to just. I would recommend it though. Buying, if you're interested, buy Claymore's excellent book on Sam Langford. So I'm wondering if there's something here that relates to. They don't say a lot about he doesn't say a lot about the Jeannette fight, but I'll just read a small excerpt. As usual, Joe's best weapon against Sam was a stiff left jab, which he utilized to good effect throughout most of the evening to score points and keep Sam at bay. Sam's best round of the fight came in the fourth when he hurt Joe with heavy combinations to the head, often causing Joe to fall into a clinch. The tide had begun to turn Joe's way in the fifth, though Sam was effective with his attacks to the body. In the sixth round, it became clear to all that Sam was tiring. It was in this round that the fears of those who were behind Sam but worried about his condition were fully realized. So I'll just leave it there, that part of the thing. But definitely get that book, folks. If you have any kind of budget and you like books, it's a good book. I'm working on a book myself on Langford, but it's just focusing on the early seasons. Clay did a phenomenal job with like his prime, that run at heavyweight, but leading up to that, because by the point when, at least right now as I envision it, the book's going to end is actually, it's either going to be the back-to-back losses to Jack Johnson and young Peter Jackson in the middle of 06, or it's going to be the 3 wins he got at the beginning of this long unbeaten streak that he began in November of 06. One of those 2 points. But it's not going to get into all this stuff here, these great battles. That'll have to be for a later project, if at all. Claymore will address that. But the early seasons, that's where I'm focusing. So in the interest of full disclosure, this is not the part of Langford's career I've done actual research on. I've done a little bit in the papers, but not like 1903. I'm actually digging, like legitimately digging. This is more, I'm looking stuff up that you could probably find yourself if you got online. What's up, 86? Big up, brother. Good show the other day, my friend. So yeah, so this is like, I'm actually having to start, not from scratch, because I'm familiar with this stuff, and I have some background information now, but this is not, my specialty is not 1913. So this is years after the part that I'm mostly focused on. So I'm doing what I can, but if I sometimes seem like I'm stumbling around, yeah, this isn't 1903, 1904, where I have a lot of stuff sort of like locked in my head, or at least like the relationships between different athletes and the weight classes they were moving around in. I wonder if I have Johnson's. Oh, I think I only did Johnson up to 11. I don't think I have his. Well, that's okay. I was going to pull his career up. But just suffice to say that, Langford, Jeannette, McVeigh, these were the top guys that were active. Johnson was fairly inactive. He was still considered the guy. There was like lots of questions about who might be able to defeat him, but they also knew that the question might not get answered with Langford, Jeannette, McVeigh as far as in their primes. Sorry, I got someone racing on the street in a second. Not racing, but going by. Noisy ass bike. That lovely city life, folks. This actually is lovely. Just loud sometimes. So even though, you can look on Box Records side, but these guys fought each other. Jeannette and Johnson fought each other several times, but not when it would have counted the most. This Jeannette was just getting going. So they almost, well, I was going to try and draw another analogy to Ngannou, but no, he's old, so he's older. He's toward the end of his career too. In fact, if he loses to Fury and just retires, I wouldn't be that shocked. Or if he moves into more of a promoting or mental role within a few fights, don't be shocked. Ngannou's not young himself, so which is why it's gratifying. You boxing fans resent the hold up on the structural aspects of the championship boxing, which I appreciate. MMA fans have been so painfully aware of the shitty pay in MMA. We're basically just happy Ngannou's getting paid out. He's going to get a boxing style payday at the end of a career that he should have been giving them to him, but he just can't get it. MMA sucks. The pay. The sport is fantastic, but the pay bites, which is why people want to fight Canelo, not the other way around. You don't hear Canelo be like, yo, I want to go in and fight. No, because he's already the man, and these guys want a piece of that. But fortunately for us, like Canelo's more interested in, like, he's already got money. He's interested in like legacy. So he's just trying to beat accomplished fighters, or at least a lot of these fights are. He's not interested in a crossover BS just for money. He's already makes money. Hey, Bruins, MMA structurally is very frustrating. It runs like leagues, but they don't have the rights of the sports leagues. They don't have collective bargaining. But the sport itself is awesome. It just depends. It's like with boxing. If you go into boxing looking at every single bout the same, like this is going to be a classic, you're going to be disappointed 95% of the time because most of these matchups don't scream instant classic. Same thing in MMA. So you could be interested in who's going to win without deluding ourselves that it's got to be a great fight or it's going to be a great fight stylistically every time. In fact, in MMA, where because of the grappling aspect, a bad MMA fight is really frustrating because they're actually often touching each other. They're wrestling, they're grappling. Yes, that is Johnson in the pick. Yeah. Yeah, I just pulled him up to while I was referencing Jeannette and Johnson fighting early in Jeanette's career. But I'll take it back. I don't want to get into. I'm doing a show uh, about 30 hours from now on, like a 3-hour show on this Bellator 300 event that's coming up. So I'm not going to go into mixed rules right now. And I will, in fact, get back to my initial graphics here. What am I looking at? Here's a good one. Yeah, Bruins, I've been rambling for a few minutes now. That's probably 30 minutes now. So I got off on some tangents, which is natural. And I was just explaining myself, I guess, that this isn't my main. I researched these guys, but I'm mostly focused. Actual research is focused years before this, so I'm doing my best with information that's incomplete. In fact, I had a mistake on my graphic 2 days ago. I had 1915 as a date on the list of the fights leading up to the. It was supposed to be 1914. It was actually the point of the show, and I had the date wrong on the graphic, which I then fixed. But just working through as best I can. There's a shot on the left. There's a picture of Langford hitting Jeannette. Looks like he just hit him with that left hook, that famed left hook. On the right there is Langford landing his left on Iron Haig, the English heavyweight champ. That was a fight he had instead of fighting Jack Johnson. He was supposed to be Johnson. This is May 1909. He got Haig instead, got him out in 4. Got knocked down early in the fight, but got Haig out of there in 4. And it's something you'll see on these guys' career. It's not every opponent, but the vast majority of their opponents that they fight, they stop. Except when they fight each other or certain select others. Battling Jim Johnson was extra tough. He and large. He could take it and often end up a decision. I got a picture of battling Jim here next to Johnson. There you go. Jim's a pretty stout fella, 220-ish. And wasn't particularly like super tall, but he was thick. Langford fought guys like him, fought guys like the Joplin Ghost, Jeff Clark, very clever jabber mover, very intelligent fighter. His work, fighters would use him to prepare for other fighters, big fights later on, even after he had left his prime. Like he was a serious dude. So they fought different styles. When they fought each other, they knew each other so well. So if you go on YouTube and you look at the footage of that 10th fight, that's the one in Paris that follows this fight we're talking about, the October 3rd fight. They fight in Paris. You can see in the footage, like Jeannette knows Langford's tricks. Langford knows Jeanette's tricks. So they're fighting the chess matches. It's operating on a few levels above if the opponents don't really know each other that well. Because we've seen that in shorter series than 10 fights in, where guys know each other so well. It's different. Sometimes they become very cautious. Like that last Triple G Canelo, it was like they knew each other pretty well, but it didn't translate into an instant classic. Whereas, Fury and Wilder, that got better over time, that rivalry. So there's no guarantee that that we can predict how things escalate, which is part of the fun of having a series. Guys make adjustments or they don't, or only one of them does. But here's the rivalry that they had. And, Jeannette represented Langford's first heavyweight opponent. In 1905, he was fighting middleweights. But to my understanding, Jeannette was the first guy who was actually a heavyweight, even though he was young in his career. But then over these years, Langford's putting on his size. So by this fight, with Langford coming in a bit heavy, they're both around 200 pounds, it seems like, at least from what BoxRec has on there. Hey, what's up, Andre? Welcome to the chat, brother. Just rambling about a bunch of different stuff, but up to and including this fight between Langford that was, 110 years ago today. It's crazy. In fact, what time is it? 6:30. So what is that? 5:30 in New York? Yeah, so they're probably weighing in right now, 110 years ago today. I don't actually know what time of day, but I'm assuming that the fights would happen in the evening, afternoon or the evening. So yeah, we're almost exactly 110 years from one of these great battles, the 9th fight. I can't wait to do the 10th fight. I guess that'll be coming up in this series in December on this day, uh, because there's footage of that fight. So that's going to be one of the biggest, longest live streams I've ever done, because it's one of only 3 fights of Langford's footage, and it's the only fight of his against a Hall of Famer. Jim Flynn and Bill Lang, those are interesting fights to have. The footage of against Sam McVeigh, which was filmed in Paris, their first fight was filmed. I've seen in the newspaper advertising Sam Langford doing an appearance in a talk over the footage of both the Bill Lang and the McVeigh fights. That's what sort of clued me in that it might have been McIntosh promoting in Paris, because he filmed that Bill Lang fight. And but then I went back and looked in it was either the Claymore book or the Colored Heavyweight Champions book, which is another fantastic resource I would recommend, by Mark Allen Baker. You can look for him on, I believe he's going to do an interview on 86 Boxing's channel coming up, so that would be fascinating. I'll be riveted to that one. But but one of the 2 books did actually mention that McIntosh promoted the fight. I just must have missed it the first time reading through. So he was a serious character. I mean, he also promoted Jack Johnson's successful title unification against Tommy Burns in Australia. So McIntosh was in multiple cities doing big things at this point. Well, not at this point in 13, but I mean back in 1912. I guess 13 was the last year he promoted Langford and McVeigh against each other that I'm aware of. So yeah, Hugh McIntosh doing big things. These guys got that work in this night. So like Jeannette, like I guess I'd started to mention, like he was stopping a lot of guys. Let me pull up his 13. So yeah, battling Jim and Jeff Clark lost the distance. Looks like the second fight that year, Jim got himself DQ'd. Then he stops Carlton in 1, stops Jack Reed twice in 3, Kid Cotton in 4. Black Bill makes the difference. Jeff Clark, the ref stopped that, even though Jeannette was having his way with Jeff Clark in that particular fight they had. But the ref said he wasn't trying to finish it. So he wasn't trying to knock him out, so he just called the fight off. Again, sometimes in this time, it could be a little bit harsh on the athletes. Like a bad fight today, they still get to have the fight and they still get paid. But back then, the leverage that was applied, sometimes a little bit different, I guess we'll just say. Stops Al Benedict in 3, goes the distance with the great Harry Wills. And Nat Dewey makes it, yeah, and then Dewey, Lester, and Langford goes the distance with him. So he's got quite a few finishes. The year before, he had more finishes, and Langford had a bunch of finishes. You can see these guys are capable of stopping most of their opponents, but each other is a different story. We see that today. You see knockout guys, he's stopping everybody, and then they fight someone who's on their own level, someone who's also been beaten up, the guys who are a little bit below them. And maybe that one goes to the decision. Even if they're both stopping machines, that's just, oh, you are, Andre? You're studying the fights of Jeff Clark. Good for you, brother. Yeah, he's an interesting cat. We're going to get to, I think this month, there's at least one anniversary of a Sam Langford fight with Jeff Clark. I'm not sure where I've got my notes. I should have uploaded the picture of the graphic. Yeah, I've written down all the fights that he had in that. Yep, so yeah, on the 26th, we'll be talking about Sam Langford's upset loss to the great Jeff Clark. Newspaper decision loss over 10 rounds. So we got to wait till the 26th. Is there another Jeff Clark anniversary? Nope, that's the only one that happened in October. But I will read out, though, real quick. Let me pull up my favorite. I love these pictures right here. Look at Langford on the left. Happy-go-lucky, but tough, scary. It's almost scary when the guy's nice about it. Like, hey, how you doing? My favorite mixed rules fighter, Fedor Emelianenko. He was like that. Real pleasant, real nice. Even guys who were insulting him, he would always be respectful and sport. But in the ring, he was in the cage. He was better in the ring. In his prime, he was mostly in the ring, but he was better in the ring than the cage. But mixed rules, it was go time when he was in there. As nice as he could be otherwise. Langford seems like he was a bit like that. If the guy, and sometimes he was that in spite of people hurling like racial abuse and like talking him down. He could still be pleasant, but in the ring, the only time it was easy is if he was making it easy. Or maybe when he was like 1,000 years old and certain guys could stylistically deal with him at that point, but it wasn't a bunch of guys. And Yeah, so unless you really ticked him off, like Jim Flynn kind of ticked him off. I guess he was upset. He didn't get nearly as much money the first time he was booked against Jim Flynn. He wiped him out in the round. He wasn't giving anyone a show that day or a short show. Because again, this is the live gate era. Not a lot of fights are filmed. So giving the crowd a show is actually a good thing. Letting the opponent get in there, stay in there 4 rounds or something is a good thing in the eyes of some, including Sam Langford. And the theory is like the second fight they had so that was in 1908. He just blew Flynn away, just destroyed him. In the second fight, though, in 1910, he was kind of letting him be in there, keeping hay in the barn. And yeah, he got 5 weeks later, they were booked again. This time it was scheduled for 45 rounds, and the Langford put it on him and got him out. I think the eighth it was. Flynn was like, he was really messed up. He actually took a lot on his way to, even though he landed some good shots himself, uh, he really took so much. So credit to him for being tough enough to last. But yeah, he was groggily like wrestling his corner and still trying to wing at people long after, a couple minutes after the fight had already concluded. It seems like in the footage that survived, it actually jumps. Parts are cut, so it's hard to get a sense of how long the specific thing was happening. But there's footage of him sort of, Andre Jeannette was extremely photogenic. But so it's hard to tell sometimes the footage. Just like I think someone had gone and tried to reconstruct and figure out from written descriptions which of the rounds in the Jeannette Langford fight, the 10th fight in Paris, that which rounds those were from. I haven't taken it to that level. And again, I'm years in front of this. I'm still back in 04 right now. I'm doing a re-sweep through 02 to 04 for the book. So I guess I won't get to, but someone has done that. I should try and find that. But I did throw, yeah, I went through my little folders and tried to find most of the pictures I have of these guys, at least when they're Langford. I have some pictures of him super young, but he looks like a kid. So these are like the adult versions. But here are the fights. Here are the fights, the anniversary fights, the fights that Langford had in one of the many Octobers from 02 to 26. Oh, wait, did I even do that in order? Hold on a second. No, that's not in order. Hold on. I got multiple sheets here. That's it. I rewrote it. I'm going analog, folks, writing this stuff down. Yeah, so we already did the anniversary of Jeannette on the 1st. Then we're doing Jeannette on the 3rd. Then on the 5th, we'll be talking about Langford's TKO stoppage over Arthur Cote. That was in 1903, his first full year of fighting. His second year as a pro, but his first full season, when in the sense that the way Langford had seasons, like he was busy as hell. 03, 02 is barely. On the 6th, we'll be talking about his fight in 1911 with Tony Capone, his fight in 1914 with Colin Bell, his fight in 1920 with Tiny Jim Herman, and his fight in 1922 with Cyclone Smith. So that's all coming up on the 6th. I guess that's going to be pretty meaty, although those aren't necessarily like important fights, but there's going to be a lot to say about that. On the 7th, one of his fights with Jack Blackburn, although this was declared no contest. This was in 1905. So we'll talk about, I guess, that fight to the degree we can, but also his rivalry with the great Jack Blackburn, who he was and what he was about. Get into that. On the 9th, I'll be talking about Langford's third round TKO. Is it 3? I hope I wrote that down right. I hate to make these errors when I'm scribbling. But his finish, one of his finishes over the great Sam McVeigh in 1912 in Australia. So I'm looking forward to that on the 9th, one of his great Hall of Fame opponents. On the 13th, Frank Farmer, who he got on points, a short fight, 4 rounds in 1920. October 15th, we'll be talking about his fight with Jim Barry, a newspaper decision in 1907. So that's early in Sam Langford's, that's only like his 3rd season where he's even met heavyweights. Although Jim Barry wasn't necessarily super huge, but I mean, this was like entering the part of Langford's career where he would even be, they're like, oh, this guy's a legit heavyweight. He can actually handle the larger guys. So some of the less than heavyweight sized guys were reluctant to meet him at this time, to put it very mildly. But Jim Barry didn't get fucked up. Jim Barry will fight him. And they had a bunch of battles. So on the 18th, we're talking about one of Langford's fights against battling Jim Johnson. It was a 15 round points win in 1915. Then on the 18th, we're doing young Peter Jackson, another fight against young Peter Jackson. This was 1921. Oh, I think that might be a different young Peter Jackson. I have to double check that because some of these names get used again and again. Then on the 23rd is the anniversary of his win over Fireman Jim Flynn late in their careers in 1923. So this is Sam Langford blind, still able to stop Flynn in 3 rounds. Then let's see, on the 20th, they're actually the anniversary of 3 fights. His 1914 revenge fight against Gunboat Smith, who had beaten him in the season we're talking about now, 1913. When 14, he got that back and he put it on him. It's also the anniversary of 1920 loss to Lee Anderson on points over 10 rounds. This was his comeback, like a comeback year where he'd gotten in fierce shape and he was mostly winning, but Lee Anderson got the best of him in that fight they had. And then also on the 20th is the anniversary of 1922 fight against Jack Taylor, a draw on points over 15 rounds. So 22, Langford's, functionally blind. Very little use in one eye, if any, and then the other eye, he was losing it during the fights. Would he get hit a few times, he'd start to lose it. But he had a cataract, so it was tough on him. And then on the 21st, the anniversary of a draw on points, this time against Jack Thompson in 1919. On the 26th, we'll be talking about the Joplin Ghost Jeff Clark again. That was a newspaper decision loss. That's the upset loss, Jeff Clark, 1914 season. The only loss he had that year. I think he went 13-1 with 3 draws, and Jeff Clark was the one. And then on the 27th, the Jack Lester fight, that happened this year in 1913, and his corner threw in the sponge after 5. I think it was the corner, not the fighter himself. He was just beating the crap out of him, kept knocking him down. And then on the 31st, we'll be talking about yet another Jeff Clark fight. A draw on points they had over 12 rounds in 1918. So, man, that was a mouthful. I didn't even change the graphic. I did all these graphics. I'm using the same one or two. What am I doing? Pull this up. Got in the chat. Tiny Jim Herman, Farmer Tough, your resume. Oh, that's cool, 86. Yeah, I got to definitely. I know you've done content on this time period. Disproportionately giant amount of content compared to how much I've looked at this time. So I'm playing catch up here. I look forward to. I have to go back and find out the guys you've done videos on 86 that relate in some way to these opponents, so I can hear about them a little more. So we got a lot of anniversaries coming up. That's actually a lot of. I mean, there's some multiple anniversaries on the same day, but that's a good 10 or 12 podcasts I guess now I have planned before the end of the month just on that. Plus I have my Bellator content. I'll have a 3-hour show coming in the wee hours tomorrow night, and then a 3-hour show next early Thursday morning my time, like 2 a.m. East Coast time. Both shows. So this Thursday 2 a.m. Eastern time, and then next Thursday the recap for Bellator 300. So I guess I got a good amount of stuff coming up my channel. I'm also uploading clips of me playing guitar. Not whole songs, just more like snippets of lead guitar stuff, nerdy stuff, just like guitar. Like, oh, here's a technique. Here's how I grip with my thumb on this one. But I'm putting that up on the channel. So look for that, folks. I think I actually put one up today. One clip. I'll try and put a couple more before I go into work. We got the power punch in Langford, the cardio machine Jeannette. Both these guys could do everything, but their key attribute, you would say, Jeannette's resilience and Langford's power. And the power being informed by experience as well as his physicality. That was the combination that made Langford so special. Was he didn't just have a perfect body for fighting, being a difficult matchup for heavyweights. Once he hit his full size, he also had the experience no one else had. Like the guys he's fighting, as good as Jeannette and McVeigh and these other guys were, they'd never fought Joe Gans. They never fought Barbados Walcott. They never had to operate on the speed that early in his seasons Langford had to. That gave him an advantage. If you've seen Joe Gans throwing 1-2s at you, what's a big guy going to do that's going to feel fast? The danger is more, but if someone's rolling toward you in an earth mover is different than someone like speeding toward you in a motorcycle. I guess could be an analogy. Like if you have to get out of the way of the thing that's just lumbering, maybe not so hard. So Langford Normally we think of people being smaller as a disadvantage because size and strength are generally an inherent advantage. But for people who have compensating power, speed becomes the advantage. Langford, at his best, had insane speed and sense of distance and timing, informed again by all that experience. It made him so dangerous and contributed to his power punching. If you just put him on a machine, like how much pure mass, I don't know how he would rate against the great punchers of history. But if you put him against a human chin or a body, delivering the actual goods that count to the parts that count in the moment, dude was serious with it. And unlike, say, Marciano, who had short arms, Langford didn't have to get all the way up on the guy to land because he actually had pretty long arms. He had respectable heavyweight arms for the time, let alone for a guy who was really short. So it was probably threw off people's sense of distance. So he turned his disadvantage into a strength, and it was enabled by the experience. I don't think I have graphics loaded that show how damn long Langford's arms were. There's a hilarious one of him getting off the train in London. He's with Bob Armstrong, and I'm trying to think. I think it's Al Damont who was fighting on the card he was fighting on, and George Byers. But you can see his arms. He looks like he's in a long coat too, and he just looks cartoonish. And some people were like, "Oh, he's tiny." Like the people would see him, the fans would see him, and then he'd take his robe off, and they see the size of his chest and shoulders and back, and they were like, "Oh." And this is one of those rare photos we got where you can see him flexing. He's putting a lot into that left hook. I mean, if you look close, it looks like he's knocking Iron Haig's head off his shoulder. He's in the process of actually removing that head. He's hitting him so hard. But that's one of those rare photos where you can see him really flexed up in his in part of his prime. That's 1909, and he was a scary dude. Some of the other pictures, like the stills or the photos from the fights with Jeannette and stuff, they're far enough away that you can't really see the musculature as well from Langford, just how terrifying he was for a little dude. Only little in height, in the only way you could describe. But Jeannette could get it done because he had a fantastic jab. He's a great mover, but also could get in there and do work, could survive, do well in the clinch. Like he could fight everywhere and switch it up. And with Langford, it was about that jab. You can see in the footage too. He's coming in quick and getting in and out with jabs high and low against Langford in that fight. Because you're scoring points, get in and out and land. See Calzaghe do that. Jab the body, just get in and out. Free shot. There you go. Jeannette was able to fight that way, but he could also get into a tear-up and could survive just a crazy amount. Like in 1909, what he took from not just that 49-round finish fight, but he fought 99 rounds that year against McVeigh. What he must have taken in just those 99 rounds of fighting this power-punching knockout artist, one of the scariest dudes of that era. But Langford was even smaller than Jeannette, both of whom were giving up size to McVeigh and Johnson. But Langford was the smallest of the group, but shout out to Jeannette for giving up size himself. He was not a big guy. There are pictures of him where you can see him next to other people and realize, like, for a guy at heavyweight, Jeannette was not like some giant himself, although he wasn't tiny. Langford wasn't tiny, he was just short. But these guys so their greatness wasn't just, oh, we're in open weight waters and we're kicking ass, because there are a lot of different guys who've done that, but they were small. They weren't giants, but they fought a lot of big guys. Going through Langford's career, even late in his career, there were a lot of guys, even if they didn't have huge, there were a lot of dudes walking around, big guys, well over 200 pounds, 220 plus. They just couldn't keep up with the speed and power and the technique of the better fighters. Today, maybe they've gotten better at getting the big guys a little, like a way of fighting that translates, or maybe just the larger gloves and the different conditions make it easier for the big guys to survive. This cruiserweight, which is like a barrier to the fastest of the quote unquote bigger guys. But in this time, if you were 230, you still had to take on, if you took the booking and you're fighting Langford, he's only like 175, 180 ripped at points in his career, but he's still, it doesn't matter if you're 220, he's still hitting harder than you because he knows how to do it. And he trained And George Byers taught him that left hook. George Byers, very good fighter indeed. Trained him for years. He started early. So when Langford was fighting at the lighter weights, and we'll get into that when we discuss the Arthur Cote fight in on the 5th, 2 days from now. You know, he was being trained by George Byers, who was a middleweight, but who had also won the colored heavyweight championship. He was a very high-level fighter, very clever fighter. Hold on. Neighbors going out in the scooter. Hold on a second, folks. Okay, anyway. Yeah, so Langford was receiving instruction. One of the guys teaching him was someone who had fought at the higher weights. So even though he started off at lightweight, what he was learning, oh my goodness, what he was learning was something himself. Okay, sorry about that, folks. Yeah, what Langford was learning early in his career was from an athlete who'd competed at higher weights. He was learning stuff that was applicable at middle and above, even though he was a lightweight at the time. He was also studying with bantamweight Jimmy Walsh, who's at that same gym. A very good fighter, and obviously much faster, even than the guys. Most or all of the guys that Langford did fight at those lower weights. So Langford was getting instruction that did apply across weight classes. I guess I should put it that way. And by the time this fight against Jeannette happened in 13, Langford's seen it all. What the only thing he hasn't seen, you could say, was getting that one back against Jack Johnson, because Johnson wouldn't fight him. You know, this is years later too. They fought in 06 when Langford was just the second season where he was even encountering heavyweights. He's walking in trained shape. He's still around the middleweight limit at that point. Now he's bigger this year, especially coming back from Australia. You know, beer. But and he was also wasn't as busy in 1912 in Australia, which was the bulk of his Australian visit. So the combination of beer and going to the races and just like, you know, like not having as many fights that would naturally keep a guy in shape. Like some of these guys, their schedule, they could be in good or bad shape for a fight relative to their normal, but their normal was pretty ripped. You don't see a lot of pictures of Jeannette. You know, that's an understatement, walking around looking chunky. Langford, it happened with Langford, but you know, but with Jeannette, you always see him in shape. Even there's stuff of him training guys when he's older, and he still looks pretty cut. He's in like good shape for an old guy. Langford didn't maintain like the figure, but he was always dangerous. He could always hit. I mean, when the big hitters, that sometimes the longevity lasts. If their chin holds up, the big hitters can get it done. Because even in fights, when someone's getting the best of them, like Langford fought Tiger Flowers, you know, he was getting beat on. He got landed on a bunch, but he could take it. And when he did catch him, it counted. Got him out of there. So as the puncher, Langford had a lot of longevity because he was starting to, like, this was the instance 1913 of him losing his form a little bit. They were like, oh, he's heavy. In fact, I should try and find the quote in Clay Moyle's book where from Langford where he's talking about his weight. I don't know if I can find it in time while I'm on the air. Plus, I think I've jumbled up my stack of book parts. I've read this book to death. I think I've accidentally rearranged my stack of book parts of what's left of this great book. I don't think I can find it. He was basically just saying, I'll get to it in a different show, but he was basically just saying that he had struggled to, Salmon said he was struggling to keep the weight off since he got back from Australia. But in spite of that, he's not getting, you see, Langford's not getting stopped. He's not a guy that people would have thought of as getting stopped. Like he had been stopped by young Peter Jackson in 1906, and then won 3 fights at the end of that year as the comeback. And then this graphic here starts at the beginning of 1907. You can see that he's not stopped at all. And in fact, the only 2 he lost were actually contentious losses. You see his 1912, he's not as busy. In early 1913, he gets some fights in, but not really a whole lot, not by Sam Langford standards. And part of that was being in Australia and the opportunities to fight guys like Jeannette, who didn't want to go over to Australia for reasons we'll get into on a different anniversary. So maybe that Oh, maybe it was just he was just getting disillusioned. I mean, he'd been chasing Johnson. Johnson had been the champ since the end of '08 when Langford was supposed to fight him in the '09 in May, and then he'd been chasing him ever since. And so he was probably also getting disillusioned. Like, what am I always getting in shape for? I can beat these guys, and I'm not getting a shot. Whatever I do, but there was hope because this was built. This was supposed to be the winner of this. Was supposed to be fighting. They wanted to fight Johnson in Paris. There was money available. Johnson ended up going a different way, but they did fight Paris just the day after. Had a great fight. We're blessed, even though it wasn't against Johnson. We're blessed because we have the footage of that December 20th fight. Man, I can't wait for that live stream. But Jeannette, I need to do a graphic like this I did for Langford. I need to do one of Jeannette's. So because it's uh, pure insanity. Now I feel like I did a graphic with their combined schedule, but I'm not sure. I'm not seeing it here. I feel like I started to do a graphic. I'm just gonna check. Hold on 3 seconds, folks. Yeah, I'm not seeing it. I'll have to pull it up on a later show. I actually did a graphic with their 1913 combined, so you could see how busy the pair of them were. Like early in the year, Jeannette was doing most of the work. I don't think Langford fought till March. Yeah, till March 15th. So Jeannette, I think he had 4 or 5 fights in that time. But I'll get that set up for a new thing. I'm actually getting eaten alive out here, man. Skeeter's getting me today. Holy cow. She's in the chat. What's up, Timothy? Which thumbnail? The one for the actual chat, the main graphic? I've scrolled through so many. This one right here? Yeah, it's Jeannette, I believe in Paris in the park. He's got his kids with him in the wider photo. Not that picture of Langford. That's one of his most gangster pictures. He just looks so cold right there. But he looks delicate, which is funny, but not the hands. Yeah, this one. I agree, Timothy. I love that. It's actually hard because I have so many pictures now of these guys, or it feels like I have so many that when I'm trying to decide what to use for the thumbnails, I'm like, oh, this one. Oh, no, I'll do this one. I'm getting all nerding out on it. But I think my favorite picture, Jeannette, is the one on the right here. That intense look, that's probably closer to the look you would get from him if you were going in the ring with him. You just see this willpower. I don't think Langford was, a lot of his photos, like he's sort of happy-go-lucky. That picture from Jeannette there, that you get a glimpse of the intensity where you're looking at this dude like, oh no. Especially as this is a time when there are lots of tough guys in the sport, and most of them had no intention of fighting Jeannette over 20 rounds or a finish fight. There were guys that would do it, but not many. Because Jeannette was those long fights. If the purse was right, he was down for it because that was his realm. He was already good enough to beat most guys in a shorter fight, not have to make any kind of comeback. But he had that capability. You just weren't going to stop him. So in that with McVeigh, even though he's giving up size to McVeigh, and he took a hellacious beating. There was blood all over the ring for both those guys. The corners. There's a still shot I should have loaded where you can see all the blood on the canvas. Like holy cow! But late in the fight, he came on strong. I think it was the 40th round on. He really turned it up. And how crazy does it sound to say that out loud? Oh yeah, he made the strongest showing after 40 rounds. Like, what the hell? But that was Joe Jeannette. That was part of his greatness in this era with like one of the hardest punchers of all time in Langford, one of the cleverest big man fighters of all time, Jack Johnson, even though they're meeting early in Jeanette's career, and then one of the scariest knockout punchers uh, in Sam McVeigh. So these guys all, and then later Will's like a long range heavyweight, but who could really crack to the body and had his own massive skills. Who kind of took over the mantle of the guy most getting screwed by the what was basically the white champion again after Johnson lost to Willard, but also by Johnson didn't want to fight Wills. Johnson, there were some of these guys, his great contemporaries. He was offered to fight them after he had lost the title, but it just seems like that wasn't his intention at that point. Probably because he was older. By the time he lost to Willard, he was in his mid-30s and still good past it. So maybe it was even less appealing at that point, even though he didn't have the title to protect. Let's take a look. I did, Timothy. Yeah, I did hear the story about Langford meeting J.P. Morgan. I think that's from his 1924 retrospective, but I don't know if that's a real thing that happened. Sometimes you find stuff that's, yeah, without further research, it's hard to find out if it's a recycled story or something that started being told at one point. Sam Langford was very much an entertainer. Like, I found a story in the newspaper where, well, actually, no, I'm gonna get into that. It's something about Jack Blackburn being mistaken for someone, but I'm gonna get into that on the anniversary of the Blackburn fight when we talk about his career. Yeah, same here, Timothy. I absolutely love the pictures of Langford drinking beer. Yeah, and I have to one more time. Yeah, I have to agree with you again. Yeah, that's right. The Morgan story. I saw it in Moore's biography. The source would be Sam Langford, uh, 10 or 15 years after it supposedly. I can't remember when he said it happened, but the story I believe came from 1924. The Halifax Herald. It was syndicated, but the Halifax Herald did. I think it was like My Fighting Life or something like that. The Fighting Life of Sam Langford. But he tells a lot of stories in that. But I don't know how accurate they all are because it's after decades of being an entertainer. So even though he said it himself, sometimes I still take things with a grain of salt. But it's a cool thing. Part of the reason I take a grain of salt is because he said after that he didn't wear jewelry. Well, I've seen photos of him after he said it happened where he's wearing jewelry. You know, so it's one of those things. Like in that same My Fighting Life, in that same series, he says that Joe Gans after he beat him, Joe Gans said he would never fight him again. But they were actually, I've seen in the papers, they were booked to fight the year after they fought. It didn't happen because Langford was going to come in heavy again. But so as far as like, I'll never fight you again, Gans definitely wanted that one back. So sometimes the stories are entertaining, but they could have just been stories. And we'll get into the one with Blackburn because between now and then, I'm going to look up to see if the same gentleman that people said he was mistaken for, if that story repeats over time. Some of these stories, they repeat. Like, bigger they are, the harder they fall. That term, that's been ascribed to several people. It's probably actually an ancient, saying from military affairs. But this, back when, armies would put up champions who would fight before the main battle, the champions would fight, for the moral victory or something like that. They would just a psychological component. So yeah, that's sometimes with the stories. So I try to verify things before I like amplify them without the caveats. So I still have a caveat on that story. There's a lot of stuff I haven't tried not to talk about at all, just simply because I don't know if I'm amplifying something that's made up. Some stuff is, incontrovertibly true. Like was Langford avoided? Yes. People draw the color line on him? Yes, because it wasn't just him saying it. It's not people now saying it. It's the managers of the fighters who are avoiding him saying it. It's in the press that they're like, no, we've drawn it. Like Al Kaufman, he was booked to fight Langford at one point, although, well, that's I'm gonna get into what happened with that craziness at a different time on the anniversary. But in the paper, Langford was chasing Johnson. Al Kaufman was chasing Johnson at that time, but his manager flat out drew the line on Langford. There was no chance. Although that did change later, but there was a side agreement to have a friendly go, and then there was a double cross, it seemed like, or at least according to Kaufman's ex-manager. I found an article the year after they were booked, after the cancellation, and tried to explain it, found Langford's mentioning it, but I haven't found. But again, like Kaufman and his manager had a sort of a negative parting in between the time when that supposedly happened and when he said, here's what actually happened with the fight. So again, you got to kind of grain of salt that thing. Yeah, I don't know about the real McCoy thing. I've heard that that was the guy, like the real McCoy, but I don't actually know. Again, it's like I hear stuff, but I don't actually. It's hard to go back and verify it while still handling all the other stuff I've been trying to do. So anyway, I'm gonna cycle through some of these pictures. I'm getting ready to call it, folks. I'm actually going to work. And again, I'm not as prepared for these as I wanted to be, but I do want to manage to get them in on the day or within minutes of the day ending, like I did one of them. uh, 86 Boxing joined me for one of them, and I think it was the Big Kid fight. It was a few minutes after midnight, so technically it wasn't on that day, but whatever. Time zones. I got a buffer there. I got a time zone buffer. Yeah, somewhere it was on that day. These great fighters. That one of Langford on the left, I like a lot. Well, I like both those photos. That one on the left, Langford, that I've seen that in like French publications and stuff like that. I'm assuming that was when he was over in Paris. One of the times he was over in Paris. These guys moved around, and in France they didn't have the same. Oh, white black guys fighting. You can't have that. Uh, that was in effect in some of the places in the States. It was just more overtly racist in America. It was racist everywhere, but it's just a more overtly so, and it impacted the structure of the sport. So you hear people say, "Oh, Johnson couldn't fight. No one wanted to see black guys fight." Well, no, actually, there were huge fights between colored fighters, but just not involving Johnson, other than when he fought battling Jib, and that turned into a shit show because it was a horrible fight. It seems like people thought they weren't even trying. But there were big fights, and Paris was one of those places, Australia as well, where you could get it on. You could make relatively good money. Johnson turned down lots of money they wanted him over in Australia when Langford and McVeigh were there. But McIntosh couldn't get it done. He also wanted Joe Jeannette to come. So if Johnson did retire, as he had indicated at one point that he would, or that he was going to step away to handle his other stuff, then Jeannette comes. Then between Jeannette, McVeigh, and Langford, the winner of that series that they would have held, that tournament they would have held, would certainly have been the top guy in the sport. But Johnson did stay in the craft. And so it didn't work out that way. But at different times, some of these guys were recognized as the champion in other countries by the commission, not the commission, the association would try to make the claim, this is now the guy, because Johnson is forfeited for not fighting them. And it's, see, however you were, I'm not sure. It's different now. The commissions are a little more, they have a little more power over things. But at the time, so like the English were like, well, Langford beat Iron Haig, and that was supposed to be Johnson. He forfeited because it's sort of the manly art of this time, quote unquote. You're showing the title fights are long fights generally. Like it's you're showing how tough you are. You're showing that you fear no man and stuff. So when the champions do get picky, they were really harsh on them back then. They're a little bit more used to it today. They're more understanding. They also like tied into the money making machine a little more, but like the money flows from certain spaces today that keeps the writer, most of the writers that count in line. But at this time it was pretty contentious, and the writers didn't like to see the champions not acting like a champion. Or sometimes even guys who did, but like even Joe Gans, when he was having a tremendous amount of fights, champion, including title fights, but they were still criticizing the fights where he fought at welter, where he wasn't insisting they make the lightweight limit or make something ringside to where the title would be at stake. And they would criticize that, even though he was, by today's standards, doing fine defending his title. It's just he had all those other fights, side bets, fights in private. It's a weird time for the sport, but the guys are it's a business, but every guy has his own brand. So that's why combat sports outside of a tournament structure, it can seem a little crazy because every single guy is his own company, his own brand. The brand gets old, that's it. In the NFL, you draft new players. In boxing and mixed rules and karate, kickboxing, sambo, you name it, combat sports, when you're old, that's it. The team is old. There's no draft. So that's why guys have to really be pretty merciless about the business part, because there is no fallback. Even today, all these generations later, boxers, where's the retirement plan? They were arguing before this fight even happened, before 1913 even, they were arguing for a national boxing commission to regulate things. We still don't have that. There's like a group of associations, but we still don't have it today. So, oh, you got your amateur license? Nice, man. Boxing's in a weird spot, but combat sports always seem to be in a weird spot. It's just an unstable, and it's also like what's fashionable changes. It's like in the 90s, in the early 2000s, kickboxing, especially in Japan, kickboxing was huge. gigantic crowds, right? But that doesn't mean the buzz is going to last. The MMA bubble is still going on. I mean, because it's a fantastic version of combat sports, but it, the TV ratings today, the pay-per-view numbers today, not the same as their peak. So MMA isn't it. The UFC has found ways to make more money than ever before as the largest promotion by far, but the actual, like, the pay-per-view numbers, no, they're not like they've been in the past. It's just how it goes. So there's no saying the boxing won't become the main. I mean, the biggest boxing fights are still the biggest fights. But there's no saying boxing won't evolve and adapt because people love to see people fight for money, and there's something appealing about the boxing rule set. Like a clean fight, I don't know if it's some old like inherent sort of echo of the sense of chivalry or whatever, but standing on the feet, hands only. If the guy's down, you let him get up. There's something appealing to that, broadly appealing. So that's interesting. Yeah, Japan they love some combat sports. And I think also like there are cultural reasons why, like missing weight in Japan is you're dishonoring yourself. You're not just a thing. In mixed rules, I know, you know, there are champions who've lost their title, and literally they can win the fight, and it's gonna be a no contest. And if they lose, it's a loss, but they can't win the title. They can't have it because they miss weight. Like they really, I don't know if boxing's quite that stringent, but I know in mixed rules, the main Japanese promotion, Rizin, they are dead serious about making weight to the point where one of the top heavyweight female fighter, Gabby Garcia, she missed weight. She was like crying and apologizing profusely, and it's a different culture. So maybe for combat sports, it helps keep things going. But there are also a lot of stories of crazy shit back in the day in Japan. So I'm sure still happens. So maybe we don't see as much of the craziness, but certainly there are aspects that are different. I'm gonna circle back to this rivalry and see if I can cycle through some more of these pictures before I call it, because I'm definitely due to head out to work soon. I usually do these. I'm already in the lot at work, and so I can just go right up to the hour, but it's not the case today. Oh, cool. I'm not going to try and read all that. I'm just going to put it on the screen. Boxing a quick dot. Tanabe, Toriyama. Oh, in the late 1800s. I'm going to look that up. I'm going to look that up, man. Thanks for letting me know. It's something else to take a look at. Always interested in the training lineage, especially as my favorite mixed rules fighter, Fedor Emelianenko. He studied he was world champion in combat sambo, which includes submissions and strikes. It's like MMA, but it's timed and scored differently, and it's on a mat instead of a ring or cage. But you wear headgear and stuff. But he studied boxing and Muay Thai and Dutch, like Muay Thai, but also Dutch kickboxing techniques and boxing and judo and sambo. So yeah, I'm always interested in training the training blend that leads. It's a little different in boxing, but there are plenty of different styles in boxing. The specificity of technique in boxing is far greater than mixed rules. Mixed rules, there's still so many elements and such a broad array of techniques that you can't be as exacting because there's more variables. You can't say if I do exactly this, I'm safe from this, because the thing that you're going safe from might be just a feint and there's a shin bone coming at your head as the real strike. The combinations that are available, and then you add in the wrestling dynamic. So a certain way to defend a punch, well, if the guy is someone who's capable of coming underneath your response and tackling you, taking you out of the realm entirely, then you have to adjust the way you defend strikes. So you see in MMA, a lot of guys circling and backing away, whether it's straight or on the diagonal, in a way that in boxing you might say it's in the same instance that's not optimal. But in MMA, where kicks can follow punches, knees up close from the clinch, and then obviously like different kinds of takedowns, upper body takedowns, also like single and double legs and knee tap takedowns, different kinds of things. It just changes the striking. I find it fascinating, but it's a lot different. But boxing is very specific technique, like because you have your two hands, okay? You don't get to use the elbows. You're not supposed to, at least. Got your two hands. Now what can you do above the belt? And just fascinating stuff. Hopefully everyone kind of enjoyed the Canelo Charlo fight. or at least got satisfaction to seeing what was going to happen. I guess it's one of those fights, you know. It's just what's going to happen here. Okay, that happened. Yeah, Timothy. I mean, the training methodology of boxing is so much more worked out, so much more. I mean, MMA is a different kind of sport, a lot of different factors, but the finesse, yeah, that's available, the level, the quality of instruction as far as that you can get in boxing is still higher, simply because MMA has too many factors. So these guys, they don't just, most of them don't just go train MMA. You know, they go to kickboxing classes, they go to boxing classes, they go to jujitsu classes. Then they train in MMA and put it all together. They do all that simultaneously. So it's almost like the human body has a limit about what it can go through. So you can only do so much training to be fully prepared for MMA. You can only do so much training with your physical ability without destroying your body. A little different than boxing. Like it's I don't feel like that's an adequate way to sum up the differences between two sports. Maybe I should do a whole show on that where I can lay my, like, actually have some coherent thoughts and lay them out. But definitely different. But it's good that both are thriving right now. I mean, boxing is, there's a lot of big fights have been made lately. So I know there's weird stuff going on. There's stuff about Showbox, rumors that are out there. I don't know if they're even confirmed yet, but you know, there's still a lot of big stuff going on. A lot of money is being made. A lot of people are interested in it. It's just different from how it was maybe 10 years ago. And that's been true since the beginning of boxing. It's always changing. In this time here, 1913, things which the difference between boxing in 1913 and 1923 is big. By 23, Dempsey's already had like the $1 million gate. Things have changed, you know, like for the better and for the worse, you know, depending on who you'd ask at that point. So we're seeing that today. Combat sports changed. Mixed rules have changed, even just since the early 90s when they put on the gloves and it got popularized. Because people generally don't like Vale Tudo without gloves, like bare knuckle, no holds barred. They'd had that prior. There have been challenge matches. Gracie family, one of the Gracie family fought a challenge match in Japan in the 30s. So, I mean, it goes back. McVeigh fought mixed rules challenge matches. Jeannette, there's a great picture I should have loaded, but don't, of him training catch can wrestling, submission wrestling, basically, back in 1909 in Paris. Like the Arc of Boxing by Mike Silva. No, I haven't seen that. I haven't seen that one. My boxing book collection is limited and mostly only relates to Sam Langford or other prominent boxers who fought here in Boston in the lead up. Like I have a book on George Dixon and Joe Gans. Gans being a prominent opponent. Dixon buried just down the street from me here in Boston, fought out of here. Another great Canadian like Langford. I'm gonna check that out, Timothy. I appreciate the heads up, brother. Thank you, thank you. Always good to know what it'll go on the list. There's a list. I have to keep a list because I'm not even caught up on this stuff for my own book. And here I am going doing all these graphics, 1913 graphics. I got, well, general graphics. These aren't all from 13, of course. But yeah, so I got to handle my own business, but I will definitely look into that and also look into that trainer who came over and studied with the Color Fighter from Japan. So I think we about called it. If I wait any longer, I'll be late. It ain't happening like that. So I want to thank you for joining me. I only did so much talking about that fight, but I only have so much info on the fight, and it wasn't their most important meeting. That one of their most important meetings is actually coming up. This fight at the end, December 20th, 1913. You know, firstly, it's 20 rounds. Two, it's in Paris the day after Johnson fights Johnson and Johnson. And also, you know, it's a lot longer and a good fight. And we have the footage. So that's going to be an epic live stream. Look for that coming up on the 20th. But we got a day off. I've got a day off to prepare. Then we're going to talk about, who was it I said? Arthur Cote? Yeah, we're going to talk about him getting Arthur Cote out of there. I think it was 5 rounds in 1903 in his first full season. So, folks, thanks for joining me. Um, thanks for not ducking the channel the way people duck Langford. Probably because I'm not awe-inspiring of a channel, but Langford, much avoided. Much avoided. Poetry levels of avoidance. Just think about that. I mean, it's different culture today, but Langford, super avoided. My channel, super unknown. Not so much avoided, but unknown. But that is changing. I thank you all for joining. It's just such a pleasure to talk about all this old school martial arts. And these guys were legit. They're definitely going to come up again because they had 14 fights. So this is the second live stream. So within a year from now, we'll have 12 more opportunities to talk about Sam Langford and Joe Jeannette specifically, and they will also come up numerous times in all these other fights, these fight anniversaries. Langford, 315 fights at least. So if you compare that to the days in the year, even with some repeats, it means a lot of these days coming up over the next year, we're going to have opportunity to talk about this stuff. So I hope you just have a great day. Thank you for joining me. Leave comments if you have any. Yeah, good chatting, Tim. Hey, kid, welcome. Just finishing up, but go back and check it out. Just did a little quick hour and a half rant. Dang, hour and a half. That flew by. Hopefully it wasn't horribly long for anyone listening. It certainly felt fast for me speaking, just rambling. So we're going to call it. I'm just going to cycle through these pictures before we go. And look for 2 days, Arthur Cote, and in fact, Sam Langford's entire 1903 season. I don't know if I'll read through the whole thing. We'll definitely be mentioning just in general what he did. Maybe I'll get to it. It's 28 fights in 03, so I don't know if it's impractical to try and go through every fight every time he has a fight. Like 28 times, 28 podcasts, I'm going to be mentioning that whole season as a whole. I don't know. We'll find the format. If you have any recommendations, feel free to drop them in the comments. Like and subscribe if that's your kind of thing. And thanks for joining. And we'll be back in 2 days. Take care, folks.